right, so today, broad patterns of evolution. We're looking at how we understand the way things have changed. We've talked a lot about allelic frequency changes. So we've talked a lot about microevolution. Now we're going to look at, here are some ways that we understand how macroevolution works. Again, macroevolution is much harder to test, much harder to do an experiment for. You can directly test allelic frequency changes. It is much, much harder to test, I don't know, going back in time and figuring out how things actually happened. In order to do a lot of our research into macroevolution, we're looking at fossils. Fossils are simply preserved remains of ancient life. I've put a bunch at your desks or at your tables so that you can, fiddle around with them, because I know you guys need things to work with your hands when you get bored listening to me. There's some pretty cool stuff over there. I've got some megalodon teeth, and I'll go over, hopefully, all of those as we get through this. But you've seen fossils before. Has anybody not gone to a museum at some point in their life and seen a fossil? If not, really easy. There are fossils at your table right freaking now. There are lots of different forms of fossils. Molds, casts, imprints, preservation, and petrification. Each of these is a different process, but they all move to preserve remains of life. The first one I want to talk about is a mold. This is a hollow impression of an organism in a solid rock. It's almost like, I wish I had some Play-Doh, because that's what goes through my head. You guys have played with Play-Doh before, right? Imagine taking a thing of Play-Doh and putting your knuckle in it, and then removing your knuckle. Now, in the Play-Doh, there's an impression of your knuckle. Does that make sense? If that was so if something comes along, dies, falls over, rots away, you've left an impression in it. That's called a mold. Well, in art, what do you do with molds? You mold things, thanks. You create casts with them. You create statues. You create three-dimensional impressions. That's called a cast. So this is the other side. It's a solid the cast is a solid impression of an organism in rock. Usually, casts go with molds. So if you look, some of you guys have these trilobites here. This is a cast. Let's see, cast. You guys should have an ammonite, a big thick one, right? Big thick round one. Yeah. So you see that one there? That's a big thick round one. Is it sticking out or is it sucked in? It's sticking out. So is that a cast or a mold? That's a cast. And then on the other side, that back table, you have the other end. Not that one. That's really good. That's absolutely a cast. That is picture perfect cast. Yeah, but that one there that you picked up, you see that one? Pick it up again. So is it indented or is it out? It's indented. So is that a cast or a mold? That's a mold. All right. Can you pass that this way? Give it to Stephanie. Okay, now you pass yours that way. Give it to Stephanie. Okay, now Stephanie, take a look at them. What do? One goes into the other. Do they click together? They should. They do. It's like a puzzle. Literally, can you close it back up? So you see this rock. Literally, this rock. That's what fossils look like in the wild. A rock. And then you get super lucky, and you break open the right rock. The cool thing is, because of the way the rocks form, and these fossils form, the fracture points are usually right over the cast and the mold. So if you break the rock open, usually it'll pop open to the fossil without much damage. If you ever want to go fossil hunting, which I really, really do. Another type of fossil is the imprint. An imprint is different from a cast. I'm sorry, it's different from a mold. Because with an imprint, it's a footprints or traces of an organism's existence. It's not the organism itself. So it's sort of like evidence that something was there. If you're walking outside and you notice there are deer prints all over your garden and your tomatoes are gone, what does that tell you? Deer were probably there. You don't see the deer itself, but you see the evidence of the deer. That's what an imprint is. Evidence of their existence without actually seeing the organism. Now, evidence can tell you a lot of stuff. These, like, footprints can tell you a lot of things. And the simple one, right? If it's a big foot or a little foot, what does that tell you? Not trying to trick you. Yeah, relative size. But then you get some really neat things if you could find a bunch. For instance, if you were to have footprints that are equidistant from each other like that, what does that tell you? It tells you leg span. It also tells you something about what the organism looks like. What do you think? 2 legs. Is it 4 legs? It'd be hard to be 4 legs. If it was 4 legs, what would it look like? Look kind of like this. Let's see. It'd be like that and that. Sort of like that. How about this? 2 prints parallel to each other the whole way down. What does that tell you? It hops. How about that? It has a tail. Something even cooler. It shows out. What's the difference between that? What does that tell you if they're much farther spaced apart? What? Smaller and bigger? Well, they're the same size foot. Taller. Could be the leg length. It could absolutely be leg length. Could also be speed. Because you think about, oh, this is going to be hard with the microphone on. All right, so I could walk slowly, and if I'm walking slowly, my feet are close together. If I'm going quickly, they're farther apart. Does that make sense? So you could have imprints. Or you might have preservation. Preservation happens when the entire organism is preserved in some sort of casing. One of you guys has a raw piece of amber. It looks like a yellow rock. All right, so that raw piece of amber is tree sap. Literally, sap from a tree solidifies and sometimes trapped in amber, and I don't know if it's in that one. I have a really good example that I left at home. You'll find microfossils, little bugs. I assume you've seen Jurassic Park at some point in your life, and you're like, mosquitoes get trapped in amber. They absolutely do, and they are well preserved. Not preserved enough to extract dinosaur blood out of them. We get dinosaur DNA from totally different places, but we do have lots of dinosaur DNA. We actually have almost complete genomes of dinosaurs, which is really, really cool. But, so here we have, this is actually right out of Jurassic Park. Here we have a mosquito trapped in amber, a mammoth frozen, and then, of course, the mammoth again. I love how this mammoth looks like it has Ugg boots on. But from those remains, those are really, really well preserved. This organism died tens of thousands of years ago, but it was preserved in ice. Heck, humans get preserved all the time. There's mud bogs in Scotland. I think it's Scotland. Peat bogs. And thousands of years ago, people would throw their dead into the peat bogs, and that was sort of the burial ritual, we think, Paleolithic times. Well, as time goes, sometimes those bodies get untrapped from the bottom and float to the top. And it's fairly common for the police to be called to find a dead body, a very, very well-preserved body, that they then have to look at and say, okay, this wasn't a murder. This person died 5,000 years ago, or actually probably 2,600 years ago. We don't have jurisdiction. Let's see. Even more recent examples are Mount Everest. You guys heard of Mount Everest? What do you know about Mount Everest? What? Who lives there? The Yeti lives there. That is the most important thing to know about Mount Everest. It's also very tall. People climb Mount Everest. Why do people climb mountains? Achievement, because they're there, and they can. So you're climbing Mount Everest. Mount Everest, in order to get to the top, you need very specialized equipment, and you actually need to take your own oxygen with you, because you get too high up and you lose oxygen. Lots of people die on Mount Everest. And when they die, it is too dangerous to bring back their bodies. So as people hike Mount Everest, they actually use as landmarks the preserved remains of other hikers. People who have died in their sleep and they just left them there. They give them names like Yellow Boots and things like that because they're still in their boots. Very well preserved. They would be considered a type of fossil. Their remains are totally preserved. Yeah, if you're interested, totally read up on the bodies on Everest. Each of them has a very interesting story. Oh, World War II soldiers fighting the Alps. They died in the Alps. They lost their bodies. Because the Alps are thawing, they fell into crevasses. Now there are all of these corpses of World War II soldiers that are perfectly preserved. Their clothing is exactly perfect. You can still find exactly what killed the wounds that killed them. They are absolutely perfectly preserved, and they're all being thawed out now. That's preservation. And then finally, the one you probably know most about, which is petrification. Hard parts are buried and replaced. So you've got these organic components that are replaced by a mineral. Most people, when you go to a museum and you look at these dinosaurs, that's not Parasaurolophus, is it? I forget what it is. They look and they're like, look at the dinosaur bones. They're not bones. That they're as if the bones have been replaced by a rock. They're much heavier than bones, right? Here, feel this compared to this. So we've got two bones here. Feel the difference in weight. They are fairly recent. Both of them are from manatee. Pick it up. Feel the difference. See how one's lighter than the other? One has had mineral replacement. The other one is in the process of mineralization. Here, just take a look. And you can see there's a difference. So as time goes on, these bones get replaced by a mineral. All right, so we've got our 5 types of fossilization. So we need somebody to science these things, somebody to study it. The person who studies them is the paleontologist. I will be dead honest, as a child, I really wanted to be a paleontologist. That was like, you go to kindergarten, they're like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I could say paleontologist when I was 5. And the other kids are like, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a train. And then, because they're 5. And I was like, I want to be a paleontologist. And they're like, scale it back a bit. You're a little short, aren't you? Oh, fun story. I almost got held back in kindergarten for being too short. They're like, really? You can do that? Yeah, apparently they could. And then my parents were like, why? And they're like, well, he's smaller than everybody else. And they're like, what about, does he not know something? Like, no, he's well advanced of the other students. He's just really small. I'm like, shut up and move him on. So, fun story. Okay, you guys know this, again, Jurassic Park. That's not what paleontologists are like. This is what paleontologists are like. This is Jack Horner. He is one of the coolest paleontologists out there. He's one of the, by coolest, it's relative. But he's the paleontologist who put forth the idea that dinosaurs were actually more warm-blooded, that they took care of their dinosaur families. That he works out in Montana at Egg Mountain. It's really good stuff. One of my personal heroes. So we've got to get these remains into rock. So here's the basic process. You got to know a little bit of geology. Do they teach geology here? Do you know? Nobody's ever taken geology, right? Okay, good. I'll just make it up. This is the baseline geology you need to know, because apparently in biology you need to know chemistry, physics, and now geology. So, rocks. We have all seen them. You guys know that rain falls on rocks. It happened yesterday. And you probably noticed in a deluge, what happens to those sediments? Rocks, dirt, not trying to trick you. Rain comes down, whoosh. Then what happens? It washes away, and it goes somewhere, and it takes those rocks and sediments with it. Where did those sediments come from? That dirt. So what happens is, you get some rocks, rain gets in them. Water fills it up. Then it freezes. Haha, back to Bio 101. What happens to water when it freezes? It expands, and it pushes the rocks apart. That causes wedging, eventually breaking the rocks down. You get other natural forces. Wind. Wind will wreck a mountain. You don't think of wind as being sort of a nature's cleaner, but it will abrade a mountain. If you've been to the beach, I taught at a college where like nobody's seen a beach. It's kind of weird. If you've been to the beach, you'll notice two things. There's a lot of sand. Okay, good. And it's windy because of the way the differences in temperature between water and the air. What happens when the wind kicks up on the beach? It hurts. Why? Because the sand hits. It runs up against your skin. It gets in your eyes. It sucks. It even sucks more when somebody's like walking next to you and they're kicking up sand. So imagine that over millennia, over thousands and thousands of years. It's like being sandblasted down. So everything's getting smoothed. Water also has an effect on this. Think of wave action. At the beach, again, waves have a lot of sand in them. You've been there. You've been in a wave. You came out of the wave, and your bathing suit was absolutely filled with sand, right? It sucks, because then you're trying to get it all out. I'm lucky I've got pockets in my bathing suits, so every time I get hit by a big wave, I have to like empty the pockets of all the sand. Perhaps you don't understand that. The big thing is that sand in the waves can abrade. It can sort of rub things raw. You'll notice that in the sea, along the shoreline, you don't have many jagged rocks. They're worn down. And where does all of that sediment that was there go? It falls off. It eventually gets moved to the lowest point. I recently saw the Rocky Mountains for the first time. I was very excited because I was like, hey, look, real mountains. I grew up here in Virginia, where we say these are mountains, but really, they're kind of just big hills. They used to be mountains, though. They used to have, like an identity, I guess, more than just a hill over there. They used to have these tall, jagged peaks filled with snow. The Appalachian, right? I've always said Appalachian, but people keep correcting me. They say Appalachia. Tomato. They're two. Well, that's the thing. I'll go with Appalachia simply because I'm scared of the woman who will correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm not scared of you guys yet. So, no, and I got to send her a copy of this. I'll be like, it's Appalachia because I'm scared of Vicky Taylor. So, the Appalachian Mountains, or Appalachian Mountains, depending on tomato or tomato, are much lower now. They've been worn down. Where did all that sediment go? They used to have big peaks. They're gone. So, obviously, it didn't just disappear. Where'd it go? Down into rivers. And then where'd the rivers go? Where? To the ocean. Chesapeake Bay, right? Chesapeake Bay has so many fossils in it. It's awesome. As water moves down from mountains, carrying with it sediments, those sediments are going to find the absolute lowest place they can to settle, whether it's at the bottom of a lake or coming off of a river and down off the continental shelf. They always settle to their lowest point. So if you're an organism and you die, and you happen to be in this area where sediment is drifting over top, that's why we have a lot of remains of fossilized aquatic organisms. As sediment drifts over top, it begins to sort of form layers. So here's a fishy. Fishy dies, and then gets covered in the silt. If you've been in a lake before, yeah, you've been in a lake. What does the bottom of the lake feel like to your toes? What, gritty? If you go out a little bit farther, not much farther, it becomes a sludge. It's mud. It's fecal matter. It's not your fecal matter, but it's like fish fecal matter and dead plant material. It is. Scoop up a handful sometime. Now that I've told you what it is, you're not going to. But if you scoop up a handful, it'll come up like black. It is super organic. And I mean that in the most scientific way possible. It is filled with dead material that's just degrading. If an organism falls and lands in that, it leaves an impression. And then if that becomes covered up after a rainstorm and more sediment gets pushed over it, it gets covered. So time passes by. That organism's sitting under a layer. Now that layer may protect it from being eaten. It may protect it from being destroyed. It's just sort of sitting. And other sedimentary layers build on top. That increases pressure, changing the rock type as you go down. You go from mudstone to siltstone and farther down until you hit conglomerate. The more it gets compressed. What that leads to is this idea that the lowest rock layer is usually the youngest rock layer. I'm sorry, the oldest rock layer. The farther down you go, the older the rocks, usually, which puts the youngest rock layers on the top. So we've got this organism buried in mudstone, buried in siltstone, not being broken down, not being degraded by bacteria. It might be an anaerobic area or anoxic area. It may not have oxygen. So over time, water fills up the structures in the organisms. You've got a lot of open space in your body. You realize that when you're drowning. Don't drown to find this out. But if you start drowning, what fills up? Your lungs, right? You get water flushing in there. Throughout the rest of your body, you've got these big open spaces, open cavities. It's not like when they cut you open, you're a big balloon filled with blood that just pops. Those open areas start to get filled with water. And that water, like all water, has dissolved minerals in it. So you've got water seeping in, you're breaking down, but those minerals may be becoming incorporated into your remains. The water, as a solvent, slowly dissolves you. Oh, I should stop talking about you. Slowly dissolves this fish. I'm not like, you're dead at the bottom of the sea. Sorry about that. I didn't. Slowly dissolves that organism. If you've seen leaves in water, leaves break down in water over time. Really just about anything does. So that organic material is dissolving. And when it's dissolving, the minerals that are in the water get deposited. So now these minerals, these dirt pellets, these little bits of rock that are dissolved in the water are being filling those spaces. The way I think about this is like plaster into sponge. You guys know what plaster is? Plaster is something you use to, you can use plaster to make molds and things like that. Plaster is, I use it for drywall. If you were to take a sponge and put it into plaster, wet plaster, what would happen? It would fill the holes because it's a sponge. And that's what sponges are for. They suck stuff up. So the water fills the holes. As the sponge breaks down over time, but the plaster remains intact, what you leave behind then is a perfect impression of the holes in the sponge. Does that make sense? Absolutely perfect impression of it. The next step that I didn't show there is that's the first stage of fossilization. You leave behind this mold. The next stage is that mold sort of gets filled in with even harder materials. And that's where you get the casts. So some of you guys have casts at your table. Very, very hard casts. Those casts are hard as rock because really they are rock. All right, so if we're hunting fossils and we're trying to figure out where to look for fossils, we don't want to look for fossils on the very top layer of very young sediment, something that was just deposited. There's nothing there. You want to look farther down, but sometimes the bottom's not always where it should be. Here, we want there to be layers going sort of horizontally, but it doesn't. These layers go like this. They go at an angle. And the really weird part about this particular outjutting is the youngest ones are the highest and the oldest are at the bottom. Wait, no. The oldest are at the top, the youngest are at the bottom because this whole area upped and flipped. Turns out the Earth is always moving. I know, it's weird. So we've got a few different ways of dating fossils. One is their position within rock layers. If you can date the rock layer, you know about how old that fossil is. And the other is with what's called radioisotope dating. Typically, younger fossils will be in the higher layers of sedimentary rock, but what really matters is being able to date that layer. You can get a relative idea of how old things are by their positions, but you really want that to be able to date the layer as best you can. Because those layers can shift due to upthrusting, they can shift due to continental drift, and they can shift due to subduction. In case you didn't know, have you guys heard of Continental Drift before? Has anybody not heard of Continental? No, wait. Who's heard of Continental Drift? Okay, just making sure we're on the same page. Some people have never heard of Continental Drift. Basically, you can think of the Earth as something that's got a solid inner core, probably a magnetic substance, a liquid outer core, and then as you get farther and farther from the outer core, it gets a little bit stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. Toward the surface, as you get closer to the surface, it's still fairly liquid. Things are still moving. They're not moving freely, but they are moving. On this sort of liquid outer part of the Earth, you've got continental plates, and those plates are moving toward each other or away from each other. Sometimes they're going to collide. Where they collide, or where you get a fault, you may have what's called upthrusting. So two layers can hit, and you can get a mountain being forced up. You might have what's called a fault line. That fault line is where two parts of a plate are meeting. And if one of those shifts rapidly, there's a quick break. It's sort of like, you know those people who just snap? Everything seems like it's going fine, and then all of a sudden they're just going nuts? You do. Good. Well, not good, but you understand what I'm talking about. That's what the Earth is sort of like. Everything's fine, everything's fine. Oh, God, it hurts. That's an upthrust. It will shift a portion of rock straight up. Continental drift led us from Pangaea to Laurasia and Gondwana to our modern world. And you could see basically the same shapes of the modern world, slight differences, but pieces break off and they shifted apart. That means that we should find organisms from the Jurassic stage on both the South American, the eastern South American edge and western South African edge. They should have the same organisms living there. We can predict that. Subduction happens at zones where these continental plates meet and one goes under the other. And where it goes under, that's going to create a lot of friction. And that friction creates magma. Magma will upwell, will as best it can try to reach the surface. And as it's going up, it's creating volcanoes. This is what's happening along the Pacific coast and the ring of fire surrounding the Pacific Ocean. Plates are going under the others, and that's causing a line of volcanoes. This is how Hawaii formed, in case you ever wanted to know. So between these plate movements, you don't know where really the fossils located on the top or the bottom, how they're related to each other. So we have to figure out a better way of dating. The best way that we have of dating is through radioactive isotopes. You guys remember what an isotope is? Bio 101. What is an isotope? Thanks for remembering things. You can do it. ISO, what does it mean? Just a prefix. Just a prefix. Yes. That's exactly right, Emily. I'm so happy for you. I'm proud of you. Be like Emily, people. With the whole knowing things, not all the rest. So. You're awesome, Emily. So the idea is it's an atom that has differing numbers of neutrons. An isotope of an atom, that is, of an element, in a given amount of time will slowly break down into a different isotope. The amount of time it takes for that particular isotope to break down into another isotope, to break down to half the amount of isotope, is the half-life. So here, if my half-life is, say, 1 unit, 1 billion years, whatever, I start out at the beginning with newly formed mineral. It's 100% pure of one isotope. Over one half-life, it breaks down into half. So instead of having 20, I've got 10. Over another half-life, the original sample that's left breaks down into half. So now instead of having 20, I have 5. Then it breaks down to half again, so I've got 2.5 instead of 20. So every half-life, you're getting a new ratio. And using this, if we know the amount of time it takes for an isotope to break down, if we know its half-life, and we know how much, we know we had a pure rock at some point, we know its half-life, we can date to when that rock was formed. Now, some elements have a really short half-life. Other elements have an insanely long half-life. Carbon-14, for instance. You may have heard of radioactive carbon dating. Carbon-14 will break down to nitrogen-14 after 5,700 years. That makes it really good for dating human artifacts, for dating more recent events. Boron, on the other hand, breaks down after 1.5 million years. That would make it useful for dating things, in the Jurassic or Triassic, many millions of years ago. Uranium is great for dating things that are, let's say, probably close to the Earth, the beginning of the Earth. Whereas samarium is good for nothing. It's literally, its half-life is close to the age of the universe. So really, you don't really use samarium for anything. But we know its half-life. There are other elements that we use more commonly in the lab that will break down over time. I had to use some radioactive isotopes, which is a bad idea. I was working in a gene sequencing lab, and it was doing because I did population genetics, that was like my thing. And we were doing some gene sequencing to compare to different species. And we were using a radioactive dye in order to label the DNA. Well, somebody spilled it. So, you spill a radioactive isotope all over the floor, and you're automatically thinking, oh God, I spilled a radioactive isotope, we're all going to get cancer and die. That is the first thing I thought. Okay, and by somebody I mean me. And I was, in fact, the one who spilled it. And I panicked because I was a graduate student. I didn't know any better. And my super calm, awesome professor came out wearing flip-flops in the lab like he always did. And he looked at it. He was like, did you spill the radioactive isotope? Which is not something you ever want to hear. And I was like, yeah. He's like, don't worry. And I was like, how do I not worry? There's a radioactive isotope all over the table. He literally took a piece of cardboard, put it on top, and then said, don't worry about it its half-life is only a few hours. You're going to be fine. It's like, oh, well, never mind then. Everything's cool. So some things break down much, much, much faster. When you're using radioactive isotope testing, you're going to, especially for older fossils, what you want to do is find a rock, an igneous rock that's contemporary with the fossil. Look at the rock layer. Look at the sediment layer. Find an igneous rock in it. Igneous means it was made by a volcano. Because with an igneous rock that come from lava beds, they will contain uranium in them. But they will never contain lead. That is something super cool about lava. In case you didn't know, lava fact, there is plenty of uranium in it, but there's absolutely no lead. Now, uranium, over time, will break down into lead. So if this lava poured out of the ground and creates a rock, you know right then that rock will have uranium but no lead. If you test that rock later and you find lead, it means that the uranium is breaking down and turning into lead. So you can gauge how old it is based on the based on how much lead is present and in what ratio to the uranium. Because we know the uranium's half-life. So that U-235 turns into lead-207, and you just measure the ratios. The one we're generally going to use to date fossils less than 50,000 years old, so all of human civilization and our immediate precursors, is going to be carbon-14. Carbon-14 is produced at an absolutely constant rate in the atmosphere, and it is in a known ratio to carbon-12. So the way this works and how this carbon-14 gets into us. First, we have to get it built. Cosmic radiation. I hate blaming things on cosmic radiation, but in this case it really is. Cosmic radiation will strike an atom out in space. Not in the atmosphere, out in space. That will cause the atom to break apart. This is cosmic radiation. This is why you don't go into space without a spacesuit. And the whole breathing thing. There's more to it than just the breathing thing. It's and the exploding thing. Okay, there's a lot of reasons. If you're ever going into space, wear a spacesuit. Cosmic rays strike the atom and it breaks the atom apart. When that happens, a proton goes one way, neutron goes another way. It's almost like playing pool. You break it apart. Even more like playing pool is that neutron will slam into an atom of nitrogen. When the neutron, so nitrogen is, I've got one of these. So nitrogen is 7 and 14. Neutron slams into it. So what happens to the mass? It adds a neutron. It goes up. So what's the mass now? 15. The issue is, though, when it hits, just like in pool, if you were to hit, you break. You guys know what I'm talking about when I say break? Okay. You break, the cue ball hits the stack of balls. The cue ball stops moving when it hits usually. Or at least it doesn't do much. The other balls, though, expand outward. In this case, cosmic ray hits a neutron. That neutron hits nitrogen. The nitrogen then absorbs the neutron, but kicks out a proton. Proton gets lost from the nucleus, which means suddenly, now we're down to 6 protons. Well, if it's got 6 protons, it's not nitrogen anymore. Now it's carbon. That is how, and this is also decreased down to 14 because we lost that proton. So now we're at carbon-14, 6 protons and 8 neutrons. So this is always happening. Right now in the atmosphere, there's a ratio of 1 to, million, billion, 1 in a trillion carbon atoms are carbon-14. So there's a little bit of radioactive decay. That is absolutely constant. So how does this carbon-14 get into your body? Oh, tricky. This one I really need you to know. This is super important. How do you get carbon into your body? I am absolutely not trying to trick you. When you breathe? No, you don't breathe in carbon. Well, you might, but you don't use it. Come on. Bio 101. What? It's eating, yes. What do you eat? Food. What kind of food? Organic food, thanks. Yeah, sure. Meats and vegetables and stuff, right? Let's go with plants. What do plants do? How do plants get their energy? They photosynthesis. They take in carbon dioxide, right? So it's not us that takes in carbon dioxide. Plants do. And they convert that carbon dioxide to what? Glucose. Sugar. So far, so good? The carbon dioxide they're taking in is in a fixed ratio. It has a certain number of them that are C14. All right, so they've got this incorporated into their body, their plant things. You then eat those plant things that have that carbon-14, so you then take in the carbon-14 into your body, and you put it into the different parts of you. You use it to build things, proteins, nucleic acids, all sorts of stuff. So incorporated into your structure is carbon-14 in a fixed ratio. 1 in a trillion. When you die, and you will, surprise, your body stops taking in new carbon-14, which means that all of the carbon in your body starts to break, that carbon-14 slowly breaks down. So you lose that 1 in a trillion, and over time it becomes 1 in 2 trillion, 1 in 3 trillion, depending on the half-life and how long you've been sitting there decaying. So you're able to date how long ago these things were made using carbon-14. Now in the fossil record, we've got a bunch of bias. That bias can be due to anatomy, what the organism actually looks like, the size of the organism, the numbers of that organism, the environment the organism was in, how long ago it was made, the geology of the region, and even paleontologists. There's a lot of reasons that, though we know a lot about the past, we don't have a full picture of it. One reason is because of anatomy. Those organisms with super hard parts are more likely to be preserved. Armadillos, glyptodonts, turtles. They've got these hard pieces that are very easy to preserve compared to soft-bodied organisms. Soft-bodied organisms don't preserve well. If a jellyfish dies, it either gets eaten, it falls to the bottom and just sort of, this is what I imagine jellyfish do when they die. It just sort of splats there. It might get covered up, but even when it gets covered up, it gets squished so flat it doesn't preserve. Hard parts, though, when they get covered by sediment, are much more likely to remain intact. Size. You are way more likely to find a large organism than a small organism. Imagine, in this room, there were the bones underneath the, I guess digging under this floor wouldn't be a good idea because we're on the 3rd floor. But if you took a shovel and you start digging, and you just keep going down, somewhere in a space the size of this room, there's an elephant skeleton, and somewhere is the skeleton of a teeny tiny Daphnia or a water flea. Which are you more likely to find? The elephant, because it's bigger. You'll hit it and find it. The flea's much harder to find, which is why we know so much more about larger organisms than smaller ones. We're just more likely to find them. One way that people usually find fossils is by going on walks in nature and being like, hey, look, there's a bone sticking out of the ground. I mean, that's really how a lot of the larger fossils get found. The smaller ones, you've got to really know what you're looking for. Numbers. Organisms that exist in large numbers are more likely to be found for the same reason that organisms that are bigger are more likely to be found. What is this? It is a cow. Where do you find cows on the planet Earth? Pretty much everywhere. You are pretty likely, if in millions of years, if you start digging to find these bones of a cow. This is a glass frog. It lives in the 2-mile square region of Madagascar. The odds of finding the fossil of a glass frog are insignificantly small compared to finding that of a cow in millions of years. Because you have to be looking in exactly the right place, and you would have no idea what that is. The environment plays a huge impact on what we know about, what we can learn about. So erosion is a major way that we fossilize, that we get the sediment we need to fossilize things. If erosion isn't happening, if we don't have sediment covering these organisms, then they're not going to get fossilized. And because of that, organisms that are in the desert are far less likely to get fossilized than those that are in the ocean, or those that are in a wet environment. So we know a lot more about aquatic organisms than we do about desert organisms. Now, most of the planet at certain points of its life cycle was desert. So there are entire time frames of the Earth's history we know next to nothing about. Speaking of time, organisms that lived recently are way more likely to be found. What kind of skull is this? Do you guys know? I think it's a deer, but I'm not sure. Deer or a cow? I don't know. Something like that. Anyways, something very recent. This is a Triceratops. Something a lot less recent. If you were walking along in the woods and you find bones on the ground, what is it likely to be? A deer or a Triceratops? It's likely to be a deer because they are much more recent. I can't tell you the number of times I go for walks with my kids and they'll come, because kids do this, they're like, look, I found these bones. They must be dinosaur bones. And then I'm the one who's just like, nope, they're not. Dragon bones is what you found. Because if you got kids, you just got to mess with them. The organism's the chemistry associated with the organism also plays a role. So I think you guys have in the black a trilobite there, right? In front of you, Emily? So they got a lot of replacement. This is another trilobite. The chemistry associated with that particular species is different than this one. Thank you. That gets perfect casts and molds. Because what happens is they're going to attract different ions than that one will. They bind different minerals. So you're more likely to find it than, again, a worm. And finally, paleontologists themselves add to the bias. And they don't mean to, but the thing is, paleontologists live on grants. They need to get money to do their research. So how do they do that? Well, they have to show it's likely they're going to find something where they're digging. It's not like they just go out randomly and like, here, this is where I will find a dinosaur. And they start digging. It's a crapshoot. They need to have an idea of where they're likely to find an organism and then get the funding to go and do that. Because of that, paleontologists tend to keep digging in the same place. They tend to keep digging where they've already found something. And because of that, you know a lot about a very small area. There's some bias there. You might know all the organisms in this area, but you don't know what's going on elsewhere. Oh, I'll tell you a fun story. So a friend of mine's a paleontologist, and he was doing some research on, wanted to do research on the footprints of a particular type of dinosaur. Now, he had an idea that in this rock quarry downtown, there were footprints, but they wouldn't let him in. So he needed evidence to show that there was fossils in there. And if there were, they would have to shut down the whole operation until he did his research. So he broke in one night, looked around and said, and finally found them. Like, he found a set of fossilized footprints, and he's like, okay, I think that, so he knew exactly where they were. He went back a week later. He had written up an entire report that said, based on my research into this literature and that literature, I think I'm going to find fossilized footprints right in this exact spot. And because he said that, he went to the newspapers about it, so they let him on site, and they went in with reporters, and he's like, behold, footprints. I should do research on these. And I was like, yeah, you should. So they had to close down that area. Rogue paleontologist. I have a distinct idea about scientists. There's two types of scientists. There's totally geeky scientists, and then rock star scientists. So that guy, rock star scientist. Me, totally geeky scientist. Okay, so that's fossils and fossilization. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a very super brief history of the Earth. Okay? I do have, entire lectures online devoted to this. I highly recommend you watch some of them because it's super interesting. But here is history of the Earth in at most 10 minutes. Once upon a time, there was a star. That star is what we call the sun, but we didn't call it the sun then because we weren't around. That sun had a bunch of dust surrounding it, and the sun was spinning. It was a new star. As it's spinning, those little particles are being attracted to each other because of this thing called gravity. Now, we didn't know gravity existed then, but that's okay. It doesn't care. the gravity was pulling these little dust particles together. So you got a spin to them, and the particles are getting pulled. It made a whole bunch of little eddies, so little eddies in the dust. The third one out from the sun, that became us. The particles are spinning quickly, and they're accreting. They're coming together. Now, they are a random conglomeration of stuff. Lots of just rocks and things, just all coming together. With that spin, they are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're pretty darn hot. So far, so good. Over time, there's all this dust and everything. It's still coming down, hitting the early Earth. That's called the bombardment phase, where you've got all of these meteors striking. You're getting a lot of heat from that, because you can imagine a meteor striking. These aren't small things. These are big freaking rocks slamming into the Earth, are building up a lot of heat. It's hot. Very, very hot. Life doesn't exist yet. Not even close. It's been hypothesized that water was around early on. We've got actual rocks that formed during this time that can only form in water. It's called zircon. So we got these zircon qubits that formed then, but we don't know. Okay, so it's super hot. Rocks are there. The Earth is getting hotter and hotter and hotter as all of these things keep hitting, and it's still spinning fast. It gets hot enough at some point to melt iron. That's freaking hot, as you can imagine. This is called the Great Iron Catastrophe. What happens is all of the iron from all over the Earth, because it's lots of bits and pieces of iron everywhere, begins to seep into the center, because it's sort of liquefied now. So this heavy, heavy iron is heading toward the center of mass. When that's happening, it's displacing the rocks that are in there, pushing them out. So now we're getting our layers. So far, so good. That Great Iron Catastrophe leads to even more heat because of friction. So you have an insanely hot Earth that's primarily liquid and now getting into different layers. Your solid, your inner core of iron, which gives us our magnetic poles, and then this liquid layer, and eventually this outer layer. As this is happening, carbon dioxide is being released from rocks like crazy. You're building up an atmosphere. That atmosphere is super heavy. No oxygen whatsoever. Let's see, where am I? Accretion, heating up. All right, we're heating up. We've got lots of carbon dioxide out there. That carbon dioxide is super, super heavy. When you push down on something, when you have a lot of pressure, the boiling point of water is increased dramatically. Water can boil at like 700 degrees Celsius instead of 100 degrees. So suddenly, with all of this carbon dioxide and all of this rock vapor, the Earth begins to rain. And it rains, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains for a super long time. We're starting to develop our oceans. The Earth is cooling off. It's still hot, but it's cooling. At some point here, we had an impact from either a sister planet or another very, very large object. It strikes the Earth and pushes a whole bunch of rock dust into the atmosphere. That becomes our moon. All right, so now we've got water on the Earth. We've got moon circling above us. Slowly over time, we get to get life. Whole next lecture after the test is about how that life could have come about. Let's see. That life is very simple. Bunch of bacteria trying to live. One of those bacteria becomes the jerk of all the bacteria world and starts to produce glucose all on its own. It's got these twists and folds in it. It's our earliest cyanobacteria. It undergoes photosynthesis. It's so happy, it doesn't have to hunt, it doesn't have to get it. Food just comes to it now. It makes its own food. What's the downside of photosynthesis, though? What does it produce? Oxygen. Oxygen is super deadly, super toxic. At this point, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. That oxygen is it's oxidative, so it starts to break things down. Steals electrons, because that's oxygen's job, stealing electrons. The things in the water that are growing are releasing this oxygen, but they're being absorbed by ferric sulfide, iron dissolved in the water, because there's still a lot of iron in the water, like just dissolved minerals. So what color does iron turn when it's exposed to oxygen. Red, just like Virginia clay. So you've got these red iron oxides in the ocean. Eventually, those can't contain the iron and the oxygen anymore. They burst in the atmosphere, and then all of those anaerobic organisms that were doing so well start dying off. Downside is oxygen's what's known as oxygen is not a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is. So if I've got a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere and lowered CO2 levels, what happens to the atmospheric temperature? Putting up a lot of oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide. Temperature decreases. We enter into what's called the snowball Earth phase. Snowball Earth is pretty much Earth gets cold super fast. Glaciers start to form at the poles and work their way down. Glaciers are what color? About white or blue. They reflect a lot of light. If they're reflecting light, not absorbing light, Earth cools down even faster. Eventually, the entire Earth is covered in ice. The early cyanobacteria at this point have likely combined with one of the bacteria, and we end up getting these more complex life forms, our eukaryotes. And those eukaryotes at this point had established a really, really efficient system for producing energy. What is the efficient system that eukaryotes use to produce energy? Taking advantage of all of that oxygen. What process is used that uses oxygen, produces a lot of energy really, really efficiently? You use it all the freaking time. No idea? Aerobic what? Aerobic cellular, oh, yeah, aerobic cellular respiration. That gave us an enormous advantage over everything else. Now we can survive the winter. Over time, we've still got volcanoes under the Earth, which is great because they're belching up a bunch of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide's a greenhouse gas, so what happens? Earth starts to heat up, glaciers recede. We've got now eukaryotes firmly entrenched as the dominant life form. So life comes back. All right. At some point, these eukaryotes establish some genes that are necessary for holding on to each other, cohesion, and genes necessary for communication. So they talk back and forth. They start to hang out together. They start to become larger and larger organisms. Divide and adhere. We'll talk about that soon. So you go from being very simple life to all of a sudden complex multicellular life. This is called the Cambrian explosion. Everything is alive, and they look nuts. Things that have, right now we have bilateral symmetry, a left and a right. But these are organisms with like pentalateral symmetry. They'd have 5 different sides. They were really awkward and weird looking. But the neat thing is they had eyes, and they developed armor eventually. These organisms were the dominant organisms. The things that had eyes outcompeted everything else. So now most things have eyes. At the end, there's a lot of life, and then everything dies. I know, right? There's a lot. I don't have time to get into why everything died, but there's a big extinction event. That extinction event, so we had an extinction event, and then some of the cyanobacteria were doing really, really well. The algae. They were doing so well that they decided to move on to land because nothing else is on land. When they got there, they got established a foothold over time. We'll talk about that later in the course. And that led to them taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at higher rates. So what are they putting back out? Taking in CO2, what do plants put out? Oxygen. All right, so that oxygen is now being pumped into the atmosphere. So the oxygen's in the atmosphere. What happens to the temperature? Temperature goes down. So you got a lot of oxygen. Temperature goes down. That leads to a major climate shift, leading to a lot of death. But don't worry, there are volcanoes. Everything warms back up. And then animals say, hey, land looks pretty cool. First thing out of the water weren't us. Now, well, sort of. First thing out of the water were a bunch of spiders, really. Spiders, centipedes, arachnids. They're like, yep, we're just going to go for a stroll here. They carried they almost had a reverse scuba tank. They carried water with them onto land. They started going inland. There was nothing there that could eat them. Life was good for them. Then we came out of the water, saw these giant insects, went back in the water. We stayed amphibious for a while. Eventually, animals get a foothold on land. We're living there with the plants. And what you end up seeing is cycle after cycle of world heats up, world cools down. So carbon dioxide levels go up, temperature goes up. Suddenly, oxygen levels increase, temperature goes down. With each of those shifts, every time CO2 goes up, oxygen goes down, or oxygen goes up, CO2 goes down, you have a mass extinction event. Everything dies. And then, to fill the void that was left, you get what's called adaptive radiation, which is something that's absolutely on that test that's coming up. Adaptive radiation then fills all of those empty niches. All right, this happened many, many times. We have now entered into an era that some people are calling the Anthropocene. It's starting to get hotter again. We're starting to see mass extinctions again. It's the same thing that's happening cycle after cycle after cycle. It's happening really, really fast now, but that's where we are today. Does that mean humans will go extinct? Probably. I mean, most things go extinct after a time. We're a dominant organism now, doesn't mean we're going to be dominant forever. But now we're all caught up to date. The end. That is a roughly 3-hour lecture down to 10 minutes. Questions?